Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Bear Share Show. Again, my name is Andre Matoyer, and today I have a special guest host, the lovely David Rodriguez.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Andre, and your audience for having me on. I'm definitely excited to be able to have a really great conversation with you, and hopefully everyone else finds it very useful today.
Absolutely. And today we have sort of a more difficult topic. And David, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this one with me, but it is something I think people are going to appreciate having, like listening to the conversation and, knowing more about it. And that is about, first, the LGBTQ community is known to be pretty inclusive. That's something I've talked about a lot already in some of the other videos, like with the Bear community. But on the other side of it, there's a darker side that has to do with racism. And unfortunately, racism is something that we have seen in the gay community. So, David, I kind of wanted to have you come on and sort of pick your brain as to what you've experienced and what you've noticed in the LGBT community. So, first, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then just kind of introduce us to your experiences so far, positive, and then we can go into the negative of the LGBTQ community for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me on to talk about this topic, which, obviously, I think for many of us, whether, in the LGBTQ community or just kind of, amongst us as a society as a whole, is a rather difficult topic. But to really best understand that, I think is really to understand what really kind of makes us most similar, and that is, as a gay man myself, have had a very similar experience with coming out as a gay person, which, as we all know, is difficult enough, right? And especially to navigate that as a young person who grew up in the Bay Area in California. Was lucky enough at least to be able to have a peripheral to, the gay community as a whole, to know that, there was at least an ability for people to come out and live their lives happily and just be.
Yeah.
But, that definitely does come with its own set of difficulties as well, especially as, navigating life as a person of color as well comes with its own set of cultural setbacks that you have to deal with. And, as we start to think about, how that also then tends to play into our everyday lives as adults, tends to take on different complexities as we get older, and we start to find that, things aren't necessarily always as welcoming as they should be. So
Exactly. And I find it interesting that you grew up in the Bay Area, which, like you said, tends to be where we think of as like the most accepting area of the country when it comes to LGBTQ. So I'm even more curious to sort of hear your experiences of non-inclusion in the most inclusive place in the country. So, um, so go ahead and tell me, like, what was some of your first feelings of when you noticed, okay, hey, like something's a little off for me, like your perception of what you've viewed the community.
yeah, that I think is always kind of a weird phenomenon, right? That occurs,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's either so blatantly in your face, or as we kind of have, come to understand it in more modern terms, as these kind of microaggressions, right? These types
Okay.
of things that present themselves in what seemingly feel like small things, but really do kind of play into a much larger narrative, right? And that is that, as people of color, especially in a community like, say, one in San Francisco, which kind of lends itself to being a little bit more homogeneous as far as,
Okay.
the types of people that are rather put on the
Yeah.
pedestals as who is most desirable and maybe who is maybe less than, right?
Yes.
It tends
So
to present itself as something that's not always very friendly to people of color.
so what does that look like? Like what have you noticed? I'm Puerto Rican, but I've noticed that the darker the skin tone, the more exclusion I've seen with people. But what have you noticed to be sort of that homogenistic preferred look that you've experienced?
Yeah, I can even tell you a little bit about a more specific instance of where I got
Okay.
invited to a party once. As we all know, these little house parties and things, those
Yeah.
pride functions
Yeah.
that happen, and they're always a lot of fun, and definitely like
Hmm.
being involved in those types of things when possible. But showing up to one of these particular events and got a chance to be acquainted with some of the folks that were there that I maybe hadn't met before, but definitely kind of started to understand that there was already a feeling of an us versus them type situation or feeling among the audience, and so
Really? Were you
there
the only person of color there at this party?
was one of the few, was one of the few,
Wow.
and
Okay.
very particularly, I remember being in the kitchen of this particular party and
Yeah.
having a conversation with a few friends of mine. And one of the hosts actually had approached me and basically had addressed me as, "Oh, you're that black guy, right?" And so immediately, what was very, jovial kind of feeling in the room turned dead silent, and just remember just
Awkward.
not being necessarily, being confronted with the words to say in the moment. I just said, "I guess that might be me," and he was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, you're that one black guy." And a friend of mine actually just completely broke the silence, and he actually grabbed my crotch and said, "No, trust me, he's Latino."
Oh, yeah, but like he had to cover for you with a different race, like that's
And that's kind of one of the
frustrating.
things, right? I think it's just kind of we don't really inherently know how to be able to deal with those types of awkward moments where those
Yeah.
are clearly the times when we feel the most vulnerable in
Right.
trying to just be who we are, and
Right.
that part has become in some ways exceedingly more difficult to be able to try to make sure that we're feeling safe in those spaces when we clearly don't.
Well, we've already have one thing against us, right? Like we already have to come out, be LGBTQ in a world where even though the world's maybe getting more accepting about it, we're still the minority. And sometimes we have to be reminded of that. But then within that subgroup, you have people that have their own like biases against their own people, so to speak. That makes it a lot more challenging, to
Absolutely.
like that example with, and I hear this a lot too, and it's really unfortunate. I don't even think people realize it, but they'll say those comments like, "Oh, you're that black guy." For those that don't know, Dave's really tall, so it's like, why couldn't they say, "Hey, you're the really tall guy"? And that, not that going by someone's description is always the best thing, but they immediately point to skin color and they say, "Oh, you're that black guy." Like I don't like that.
Well, and I
I
think
feel
one of the
bad.
important distinctions to make here too is that I think the addressing of that terminology and that verbiage, right, is really
Mhm.
not so happening elsewhere with other people, right? Like
Right.
that is the descriptors that others are using when in addressing or talking about someone like myself. So that is the rhetoric and that is the thought that's being transcribed with others, and that is I think where that becomes more blatant and that a little bit more egregious. So yeah.
That's so frustrating. Um, I had a friend of mine recently. We just did an episode together on the show about the bear community, and we talked about how that tends to be the most inclusive. But I've heard differently, and I ashamed to say that I've seen differently. What is your experience in the bear community? Because I know that you are a part of that community. So what have you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the fact that I think it absolutely is one of the most accepting and inclusive parts of the LGBTQ community as a whole. I think that that part of our community is very well versed in what it means to feel maybe a little bit excluded or not
Yeah,
as welcome in certain spaces,
yeah,
but it doesn't make them exempt from
yeah.
what that feeling might be when they come to including others in their community. But I will say, as a whole, I've been lucky enough to really have had an incredibly overwhelmingly positive experience.
That's good. That's good.
But I know that that's not carte blanche across the board for everyone. So.
Yeah,
And I've even seen and experienced what that looks like, and what it is that there's just a lot of inability for those to be able to accept the fact that you can be in the same space as other people who may be different from you from a color perspective or a cultural perspective, and you're not going to be essentially labeled as not attractive because you are in these spaces with those people. You choose to share relationships or friendships with people who are different than you. And
Yeah.
as much as we are inclusive, I think there is still safety sought in numbers of people who look just like yourself, and
Yes.
that tends to be shared amongst a lot of our Caucasian bear brothers, and that I think is definitely a stigma that is kind of transcended different areas or different cities of where people live, and it's kind of more of a common experience for a lot of people.
Yeah. The whole familiarity is comfort idea. Like people are used to being around people of the same race, and so they're not used to being around people that aren't. And even if they don't mean bad, they may say some things they aren't realize are racially insensitive. Um, when I One of the complaints I've talked about with some other people of color, bears at least, is what they've seen on posters for events. Do you know where I'm going with this? Have you seen that before?
Oh yeah.
So so what do you tend to see on those posters, and what would you like to see?
Well, I definitely would say that, especially now, we see a little bit more of a broader representation of people on those types of communications, if you will, right?
Yeah, it's
Especially
gotten better.
it has, but I mean, for a very long time, I mean, it was very much Caucasian men who were maybe of a certain
Hmm.
build that was maybe more muscular. I think maybe something you've addressed in a previous conversation is that muscular men were really the ones who were kind of perpetuated as like the pinnacle expression of what a bear really meant when
Yeah,
its roots are not really based in that.
cream of the
So
crop.
so
Hmm.
we tend to kind of glorify a specific look or a specific ethnicity, whereas even you go to places like P Town for Bear Week, and you start to see that maybe there's not as many people of color represented in those types of
Ooh,
promotions for those
yeah,
events, and so the inclusivity is definitely something from a perception standpoint that we don't see a lot of diversity, right? So but as I mentioned at the top, I think that this is something that is starting to improve a bit more.
good.
Visibility is really key in that sense, and to be seen in spaces like that and celebrated as an equal part of the community is something that I think we really need to strive a little bit more for, and that we will continue to see more of in the future.
Absolutely. I did a little bit of research on this because it's one thing to have a feeling, but I just sadly I found some data that sort of backs up what you're talking about. The BBC pulled a report from that basically stated that 61% of ethnic minority LGBTQ individuals, so typically Black, other people of color, Asian, Hispanics, 61% have experienced some sort of racism through the online dating or dating in person. I remember when like 10 years ago on like those crazy websites like Adam for Adam or even early days of Growler, where you see those profiles that say stuff like, only like whites or only like light skinned Latinos and whites, stuff like that. Do you remember seeing stuff like that or
Oh yeah,
like,
absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
it was pretty much everywhere, and a part of every communication that you could even pull up for those types of things.
it's
Absolutely.
so sad. It's terrible. Or you might have the opposite, where have you ever felt like you're wanted because you're Black and because you're darker?
Well, yeah. I mean, I could probably speak for any minority or person of color in our community that we've all been fetishized to a certain degree,
Yeah.
right? Whether passively or just outright, you know, you're a big, tall black man with a big, huge black cock, right? Like
Yeah.
that kind of um, addressing of just an identity that obviously we don't presume for ourselves, and just wanting to be able to meet and or communicate with other people. That's definitely something that has put a bad taste in all of our mouths, right? And
Yeah.
so I think the more that we've had to deal with that type of stereotyping and fetishizing is something that ends up making us feel more on the outs, right? Because it's just
Right.
like, well, we're just not accepted as just people for being who we are,
Yeah.
right?
I can't tell you the times I've heard, and it's so subtle, but it's like, oh, he's super cute for a black guy, or he's like, that's a really hot black guy, and it's just like,
Yeah, we've all heard that, man. And that's the thing too. And I'll even just kind of, equate something that's kind of happening a little bit more currently is that, we see all of this, aggression towards the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and
yeah,
for years. I mean, especially on these dating sites and apps, where you see so many people just outright saying, "Oh, I'm not attracted to Asians. I'm not. I don't.
right,
No femme fats or Asians, right? Like we've all
yeah,
seen that one. That was like the cliche tagline, which was so disgusting and just horrible to read. And it's
absolutely,
again, it's those types of aggressions that just really culminate in just this overarching theme of just not accepting people for just who they are, and that part is definitely discouraging when it's come to being in spaces such as the online dating scene.
yeah. And the Asian community has that worst stereotype. So like black guys always get assumed they've got big dicks, but Asian people assume they have small ones, which is totally false. Like none
And
of
that's
that is true.
it's horrible, and again, it's like, how is that really the way that you could even choose to enter into, a conversation, or, getting to know someone, knowing that that's really kind of how they think and feel, right? Like
Yeah,
that's definitely not something that's very inviting. So that's definitely something we need to scrap.
absolutely. And what makes me so sad is like, we're currently dealing with the George Floyd case. We just had a shooting of another person just yesterday, and by a police officer. There's years of racial inequality with black people, and then the more recently the issues with Asian people, and then still discrimination with Hispanic people. It's just like there's so much of it and outside every day in the world. And then you would think that going to a gay bar or going to a friend's party with hopefully people that are similar to you, they're already a minority, you would feel comfortable. And I think that's one of the most disappointing things is it's still those racist tendencies still just don't go away just because you're with other LGBTQ people. And I really hope in the future that changes.
Absolutely, it needs to change 100%.
It, it does. Um, have you ever felt like you were really close to a relationship or passed up on a relationship because of because of how you look?
Oh man, this is the juicy one, isn't it? Um, I mean, I think, and again, I don't want to speak for all people
Yeah.
of color or anything like that, because again, our experiences do vary.
Hmm.
But I mean, there are absolutely times when you may be in the process of getting to know someone who you are obviously very attracted to, and
Yeah.
there's a connection there. But as in all relationships, there's kind of those sobering moments of just kind of, oh, now I kind of have a little bit more insight into maybe the not so great things about, maybe
Yeah.
how this person thinks or how they, kind of process life. And one of those has been that, I've not only just been fetishized in relationships, but then also kind of, the things aesthetically that I bring to that relationship, diving into that, meaning that I may be a little bit more, hip hop or thug, and
Oof.
that might be something that I kind of add uh, to their look, or the types of people that they might appeal to, because I represent something that they might not be, and
Yeah.
that part I think is probably one of the most disturbing things I think about how
Disappointing
people,
too.
yeah, and how people think about their
Yeah.
relationships, and so I always kind of perceive that as just being something that lives on the surface, but that really should not filter into my ability to be able to carry on a meaningful relationship with someone who
Good.
I care about.
Good. And it's even worse. You were talking about when you get to know someone and then that unflattering piece comes out. Um, there's some people that will have sex with people of color, but they won't date them. Like there's that fear of bringing them home to mommy and daddy and having that racist fallout, if you will.
Oh, trust me, I and we've talked about this in
Yeah.
my most recent move here to Dallas, Texas,
Ooh.
has kind of opened up, I think, a little bit of a Pandora's box of just the general availability of people who definitely would have that type of issue. Should something actually spring into a more of a relationship, that it's the whole introducing to the friends and the family, and the nervous feeling of not necessarily being accepted on
Yeah.
behalf of someone who has an issue of their own to deal with when it comes to race.
Yeah.
And that part of it, I think, is the most discouraging thing. You think about as why would this person then not be proud enough to be able to say, "Hey, yeah, I'm dating a person of color," and there's nothing really to interpret beyond that. It's just that we are two people who really care about each other. But it is
Right.
also a very real tension in a lot of ways.
Which is sad. I mean, we're like, you already meet someone, which is really hard to do because we're already a minority. And then you hit it off, which is like another issue. And then they're like, never mind, because of that. It's just,
Right.
I can't even imagine. I want to put myself on notice, just in a way like over the past 10 years, I've been more involved in the gay community. I would say the past 10 years. And even myself, I've had to notice my own tendencies around, I'm Latino, but even around other people of color. And I think I grew up in mostly white areas and white neighborhoods. And I think some of those misconceptions and some of those thoughts just kind of rubbed off on me, whether I wanted to admit it or not. And that's, I've always been really inclusive. I would never say I'm racist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, like, I think we all have little biases that we were taught or learned without realizing it. But the good thing, and I think the thing that people can do going forward, is just be more mindful of it and be aware of it. So, the next time you're describing a friend or you're talking to someone at the party, like your example, maybe don't say, "Hey, you're that black guy," right? Like, you can say literally anything else, you
Right.
know?
Right.
Just be more cognizant of those stereotypes and opinions. And I think that could be huge. That can really help someone feel more included, because ultimately I think that's what the gay community is supposed to be. We're supposed to be inclusive. Life's too short. We need to be nicer to ourselves. We already have the world against us. Let's try to be nicer, you know?
100%. I mean, and it's so funny that just, this past weekend, I had a really great experience with um, meeting a whole, new group of people who, I think
Nice.
we all probably deal with some level of kind of, social awkwardness or insecurity of,
Yeah.
being in a new place where you don't know a ton of folks, and
Yeah.
you're just sitting there trying to, be able to, find yourself in a good space to be able to be open to meeting people. And a lot of that actually stemmed from the fact that we had conversations that weren't just so on the surface. I mean, even as a part of a
Good.
broader group of people, was more shared in our experiences of we've dealt with so much lately, right? Like, I mean, just with the
Yeah.
pandemic and everything that we
Yeah.
had going on from a sociocultural standpoint, that
Hmm.
it's a lot of burden to put on your shoulders, right? And that shared experience of just knowing that, hey, you know what, we've been through this, and
Yeah.
we've put up with so much, that it really is time to really celebrate what it means to just be an individual who's just open to being able to bridge and mend the gap, to be able to just love and accept each other for who we are, and know that our community is about more than just going to events, and traveling and going to bars
Right.
and getting wasted, and like we definitely need to show more support. And I think that's definitely going to be a part of that dialogue that's really going to push us forward, and really make us better as a community as a whole.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings me to another question for you, which is, what do you hope to see going forward? I mean, I know we've already seen more diverse posters. We've seen people kind of stop and take more notice of their thoughts and actions. What do you think, or what do you expect to see or hope to see in the future?
Well, I think we've kind of already seen the foundational blocks that are
Yeah.
really starting to kind of, move that dialogue in the right direction, right? What we saw, last year with, a lot of the protests that were happening, there was a certain kind of reckoning with our reality of the
Yeah.
fact that there are still a lot of um, steps forward that we need to take. And as a community, especially within the gay community, and knowing that, the struggle that people of color face is really the struggle that the LGBTQ community faces as well, and that is
Yeah.
the fight for equality.
Absolutely.
And so kind of what you were talking about as far as, you are a Latino man, and that, you grew up in a rather affluent area, and that, there may
Yep.
be certain things that you don't necessarily identify with being a person of color from other places in our country. Really the experience is one that is still shared, because regardless of how you've been
Hmm.
brought up, you are still identifiable by others as being included in a community that a lot
Yes.
of people sometimes feel disconnected from, right? And so going forward, I think it's really going to be important for us all to look at opportunities to really devote our time and our effort to really understanding our brothers and sisters in our community, right? And,
Yeah.
and and having more of these more difficult conversations, because let's be honest, I mean, these are not easy things to discuss, and it often comes with, varying opinions on, who might necessarily be right if they're taking up, cause with a certain issue. And that is sometimes a harder pill to swallow when someone has differing views than you.
Yeah.
But I think the underlying thing here is that we need to respect each other, and that respect comes from being able to understand that people are different. People come from these different backgrounds with different perspectives.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the common theme really needs to be rooted in equality for all. And
Yes.
I think that's where, we've really started to see a lot of those um, pieces being put together. And
Yeah.
so I'm really excited to see, the progress that we continue to make, and know that, people like yourself and me and others that we've have as friends and family, we will continue that dialogue and continue to push for, more of those opportunities to be able to bridge that gap. And I'm really excited for what we have coming up in the future.
I completely agree. And I think a great place to start is just anyone who has a different opinion of you. I think just start with a conversation. It doesn't have to be total confrontational. I know one of the things that I hear a lot, or I heard a lot, in those more affluent white centric communities was, it's they're overblowing it. It's a big deal. Like it's not that big of a deal. They got their civil rights in the '60s. Like what are they worried about? Like it can't be that bad. Just kind of underplaying it all. I
Right.
think one of the big reasons why everything sort of took off the way it did last year, which is a good thing, was because we have a lot more video evidence, and we're seeing that nope, just it's not equal. And people of color have every right to be upset and every right to demand equal rights, and we have definitive proof now. And if you can't get behind that, I don't know what else to tell you. And I think just kind of starting there, and showing them, yeah, there is an issue, here's how you can be better, is a great way to move forward. And I think that's something that everyone can start doing today. Just be more mindful and just be more inclusive and accepting. And I think that could spread to everywhere and be a larger impact than you think. So,
Absolutely. I even will just kind of close on one thing, and that's, I think for a lot of the imagery that we've seen recently,
yeah.
with the George Floyd case, and, even everything that's happened, even just this past week, is that so many of us see ourselves in these situations through these
Mm,
videos and these images, right? We have a
yeah.
common strife to live and to be happy and to be loved and to experience love and give love.
Yeah.
And when that simple right is taken away um, by someone who either didn't know how to handle themselves in a situation or harbor
Right.
some level of hatred for or contempt for that person, it is one of the true robberies that occurs way too often in this country.
Yeah.
And I think that is why we see so much gravitation towards wanting to love and to really show that level of support. And so I know that everyone listening to this podcast today is really going to
Hmm.
take something away from that and know that we have work to do, but that we really will get there together and only together.
Absolutely.
So I'm really just optimistic for how that's going to take shape, and I'm really just definitely grateful to be able to have my own equal part in that effort.
Absolutely. And I can't thank you enough, Dave, for taking the time and talking with me about this. I know it may be a little uncomfortable and it wasn't easy, but I truly, truly appreciate it. And, I hope that those listening can, like Dave said, definitely take something away from this conversation. So, um, thank you so much again, Dave, for coming on with me to the Bear Share Show. And for those of you listening, if you would like to comment on the show, send me an email at thebearshareshow@gmail.com, and follow the Instagram at the Bear Share Show on Instagram, and like and subscribe it and get more content. So thank you so much again, David.
Thank you, Andre. It was really a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Have a good one, everyone.